introduce and do a little bit of housekeeping. Our format is we have 3 eminent speakers. Another we hope will arrive. She has been delayed on a flight from Dublin. And they will articulate some of their responses to the questions that you've probably seen. And then we have an interlude by our creative artist, Joe, during which time you'll have time to write questions down on the clipboards which you have and pop your questions in little boxes, which I will then look at and field to our panel after the interlude. There will be a chance to respond before that to Joe's work of art, in a mindful spirit, of course, you know, as its praise, its liturgy. And then have the questions, and probably questions from the live stream as well. We already have 1 question from the live stream, there may be more. If I have mastered the technology, we'll have more. But our technology expert, unfortunately, wasn't very well and had to go, so we'll have to deal with me instead. And I'm actually on, so that's it for that one. So, without any more ado, oh no, I've forgotten, haven't I? The important things, the fire escapes are all indicated, so I have to say something about that if there is any emergency. The toilets are at the back of the church. They're here, the toilets are here, right. And drinks are here, so if you obviously serve yourself, but we won't have a formal break because we just want to go through. So obviously, try not to make too much noise. And I hope I've covered everything on that, have I? And now, I'm going to introduce the speakers, the important bit. So, we are delighted to welcome the Reverend Mary Kells, who is a rector of St. Martin and St. Paul, Canterbury, and is the liturgical lead for women and the church. And you may see that there are flyers around for her latest book, which is absolutely perfect for our occasion. Gone beyond gender, crafting inclusive liturgy, which is wonderful in view of the fabulous art you already see in this wonderful place, crafted by many in the centuries. So without more ado, I will turn to my eminent friend.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a delight to be with you. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit more about myself before I get properly started, so you have a fuller idea of how my approach is situated, where I'm coming from. I will tell you a story that is full of change, and as I will suggest that the liturgy that is meaningful to us is intimately tied up with our own stories, this already suggests that change must also be embedded in our worship, if it is to remain current and real. I began life in the Presbyterian Church in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and after a period of teenage fervour, followed by agnosticism and atheism, I returned to faith in my mid to late 20s in London while a student at LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science, completing my PhD in social anthropology. Having decided to move back into the faith world, I got very involved with the chaplaincy at LSE and became an Anglican. My mother was most concerned it wasn't the done thing for women to jump ships like this unless they had got married, in which case they were expected to join their husband's church. But I had no husband to offer as an excuse, so I had to go and visit my Presbyterian minister in the manse in Cookstown to explain myself in order to put her mind at ease. Luckily, he was very understanding, partly on the grounds of the Presbyterian Church not being available in England. I embraced Anglicanism for 2 key reasons, I think, apart from the simple fact that I was living in England. One was a difficulty I had with the faith and context I was raised in, whereby being a good Christian didn't seem to rule out hating Catholics. I rebelled against that, finding myself a Catholic boyfriend in my teens. In the Anglican Church, my experience was that Protestant and Catholic views were somehow incorporated. You might disagree fundamentally with someone, but you still remained part of the same church. You didn't try to kneecap them. Although, to be honest, in recent times, I think there is a bit more kneecapping going on, figuratively speaking, with our battles over gender and sexuality. Nonetheless, this desire for what I might now term inclusivity, for embracing the other, not condemning what is different, for openness to cross-fertilization of ideas, is at its best what I long to see in liturgy, and I shall return to this. The other reason I had for becoming an Anglican was that I was drawn to its rich appeal to its offering of movement and colour and beauty and the smell of frankincense, the possibility of speaking, not just listening, of theatre, not just the solitary word. I was drawn, you might say, to liturgy. A caveat to this definition of liturgy is that while at St Andrews, as an undergraduate, I wrote a dissertation on the religious rhetoric of the Revd in Paisley, and came to the conclusion that although this form of church tended to reality of what we Anglicans, Episcopalians, and indeed Catholics prize as liturgy, it had its own regular pattern, its own liturgy, if you like, defined as a predictable pattern of worship and style of language, with a beginning, middle, and end. However, the more bodily, more encompassing liturgy of the Anglican Church was where I was drawn to as I made my life in England. So this leads to my first reflection on liturgy. It is a pattern for worship that we enter into as a community with a shared intent to worship God, to express our faith, and to learn from the scriptures and their exposition. Within this shared intent, different denominations and faith settings express and explore this differently, and each of these, as well as being accompanied by differing theologies, will also, and this I suggest is fundamental, appeal to different personality types. The origin of our liturgical preferences is, I suggest, more in our personality than in our theology. It is deep in the mystery of what makes us ourselves. Our liturgy, therefore, needs to be capacious and robust enough to contain the mystery of difference and the possibility for change. For me, as I suspect for you, the fuller expression, drawing on the senses and focusing on beauty, nourishes and sustains me. This can include the use of art, incense, movement, speech, making the most of the resonance of space, as we will hear more about from Joe shortly. I'm looking forward to that. It connects, of course, with an incarnational theology, an understanding of the world as sacramental, of the material world as having the capacity to incorporate and reflect the spiritual. A theology more characteristic of the Catholic than the evangelical wing of the Church. A theology in which the world, in which we are fundamentally good. Where does my favouring of this theology come from? My intellect, my head, my thinking, my analytic brain? Yes, and yet I suggest it is much wider than this. Our stories, our personalities, our settings all influence how we want to approach God. And the liturgy we are drawn to, the liturgy we long for, will reflect all of this bodily and historical experience, an experience, I might add, that is constantly evolving. the liturgy we long for. This leads me back to the question of inclusivity. I longed for a liturgy that was inclusive, that did not rule people out, that welcomed all. And as I turned to theology and to ordination, I rejoiced in feminist theology and the liturgical writing of Janet Morley and others. However, what I found as I trained as a priest, as I entered curacy, was that the Church, for all that it had resources which counselled otherwise, remained firmly patriarchal. At the centre of this is how we pray to God as Father, Lord and King. I have, you might say, made it my mission to challenge this. My theology involves a belief in the God who liberates the captives, who seeks out the outsider, who is powerfully concerned with justice. That is not, I submit, a controversial theology, not in theory. In practice, what it leads me to is a wish that liturgy can be liberating, that our worship can reflect the God we call on. My theology is developed too, influenced in part by Catherine Keller's 2003 book, Face of the Deep, A Theology of Becoming, and other feminist theology, in part by the students I worked among as chaplain of King's College, Cambridge, my role before moving to Canterbury. I am moved by a theology of becoming, of wildness, of otherness, of God working in the mess and chaos of our lives, and calling out something rich and wonderful and growthful and not too tidy. In the midst of all this, I joined Watch, Women in the Church, and became their lead on inclusive liturgy. I have set up a regular series, Liturgy Online, which offers gender-inclusive worship in which God can be conceived and represented in terms of female experience. Liturgy in which God can, spoiler alert, be she. I have also led events on writing inclusive liturgy. The next one will be online on Saturday, the 27th of September from 10 to 12, and it's going to be led by Jan Berry, if you want to join. And I have visited various dioceses to provide workshops on this topic. How do people react? I find women weep. They tell me as their tears flow, I have felt included for the first time. They say, usually when I go to church, I feel irritated. I'm waiting for the next thing to irritate me. And in these Watch liturgies, I realise I'm relaxed. I'm not waiting for the next assault. I've had men say, that was much easier than I feared. It was recognisably Anglican, the ultimate compliment. I've had people say they loved the poetry of the liturgy, that it's not just ethically correct in some way, it is still guiding us through the beauty of words and images and music towards the Creator God, in whose image we are all made. I've also had people appeal for more resources to use, for more guidance on how to write and remain within canon law, a preoccupation of us Anglicans. And so I've written a book which is, as you've heard, coming out imminently, God Beyond Gender, Crafting Inclusive Liturgy, which looks at how and why we might stimulate our liturgy with new words, new images, new ideas, and yet remain within the rhythms and paradoxically the orthodoxy of our faith, and which also provides lots of examples to use. That was, you might say, one of my first steps. Needless to say, I'd love it if one of your first steps would be to buy it and use it. I could say more. I hope I will say more during the questions, but this gives, I hope, a taster of my approach to liturgy, what it is, what it can be, and how we can go about refreshing it, so it truly reflects the God we claim to worship, who loves and beckons to us all, and who calls us again and again into change.
Thank you so much there, Mary. It sounds like an incredible read, and I, for one, will buy the book. So, our next speaker is the Reverend Canon Christoph Wutscher, who is Rector of Holy Trinity Church and a serving member of the Scottish Episcopal Church's Liturgy Committee. So, without further ado, I will pass him over.
Well, thank you for that, and good evening. Thanks for the invitation to contribute to this event tonight as we ponder matters of liturgy and change, how we shape liturgies, how they shape us, how they change and reflect on what they aim to do. I'm first and foremost a liturgical practitioner, so somebody who plans and leads worship on a regular basis, week in, week out. And with a background in church music, sacred music studies and liturgy, I serve as the rector of a congregation with a little bit of teaching on the side in liturgy and music. And as it's been said, I'm presently a member of the ACC Liturgy Committee. So that means I'm involved in very practical work of creating and updating liturgical material. And it is out of this practical experience that I speak today, but then liturgy can be seen as something immensely practical. Liturgia, the work of the people, literally, whatever that means, it involves work. If you looked up liturgy in the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, you'd find the very practical assertion that the term in English is used in two senses. First, of all the prescribed services of the Church, as contrasted with private devotion, and second, specifically as a title of the Eucharist. This is admittedly a very narrow definition of a liturgy, even if you looked at it in very practical terms. And you might have something very different and deeper in mind, such as liturgy as a mode of being, or as our prime response to life and to the world. There's certainly lots in there to ponder. But even in a narrow and practical understanding of liturgy as the prescribed services of the Church, there are deeper ways of thinking about liturgy and how we may respond to the idea of liturgical change. One starting point, one I find myself going back to over and over again, as the basis for any church life, or life generally perhaps even, is found in a passage in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Exodus more specifically, a story we often refer to as Moses and the burning bush. The Exodus is a foundational story of becoming a people of God, of learning to walk with God, of learning to trust in God, of learning to grow in God, of learning to walk into freedom in God. And at the basis of this story there, we find an encounter with the living God, who reveals, you remember, perhaps as the I am, so we could say eternal being and all there is. Liturgical texts such as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Part of a doxology in psalmody and canticles in liturgical use is reminiscent, I think, of this experience of the living God as found there. Here, mystical experience of sorts is the starting point for deeper living. It is an encounter with the living God which at the same time, interestingly, leads to religious laws and liturgies, if we read on in Exodus. So here is a tension displayed. Our freedom in God and liturgical forms and regulations compatible. The Benedictine monk and spiritual teacher is a pioneer of interreligious dialogue, particularly with Far Eastern religions and Christianity, David Steiner-Last, writes in an essay that there is no religious doctrine that could not ultimately be traced back to its roots in mystical experience. And I would like to think that the same is true for liturgy as the prescribed services of the Church. David Steiner-Last says that ritual is at first a true celebration. We celebrate, he says, by remembering gratefully. Gratefulness being one of his big topics, if you're familiar with his writing. And then he says repetition is a part of celebration. So there is something to be said perhaps about the power of said liturgical texts and rites as we repeat them. The danger is, however, he says, that when form becomes formalized and content is forgotten, ritual turns into ritualization. And David Steiner-Last uses the image of a volcano to make his point. He says lava erupts, but then inevitably it cools down and turns into rock. So it is maybe with our burning bush moments, we could say, they cool down. And Steiner-Last says every religion has a mystical core. The challenge is to find access to it and live in its power. As liturgists or liturgical practitioners such as myself, we often are in the volcano business somehow, but perhaps too much in the shifting, polishing and rearranging of boulders of cooled off lava stone. The challenge for us may be at least to learn to rearrange the stones in such a way that they are less in the way, and perhaps allow us to sit in some kind of circle, making space for a bush to burn in our midst. For liturgy is, among other things, to be afraid for our own burning bush moments. Yet such an encounter with the living God in liturgy can become a problem when we face matters of liturgy and change. Because we can so easily mistake the circumstances of our burning bush moment for encounter with the living God itself. And we can become very protective of those forms, fearing that when form is taken from us, the essence may be taken with it. I mentioned earlier that my background is in church music. I used to serve as a choir director of an international English-speaking Anglican community in my native Vienna, Christchurch, a Church of England chaplaincy, which draws people from all over the world. Music choices were not easy to make. Cultural differences of being church became particularly noticeable at times like Christmas. Okay, we might agree we want to sing Away in a Manger for our Christmas service, but to which tune? Music carries a lot of emotional connection. It's not just a carrier for text. We know that. It can connect us with or remind us of a deeper moment of encounter. And we can become protective of those connections. So as we ponder matters of liturgy and change, we might want to ask ourselves, how do we experience God in liturgy? Have we ever had a burning bush moment in worship? Or do we feel that, do we have access to the arena of liturgy or not? The prescribed services of the church. I have had strong experiences of the living God in liturgy from childhood onwards, really, but I do realize that this won't be the case for everyone. I've been privileged, I know that. So we need to listen more to those who do not feel that they have a place at the table or in the circle. And then there is the question, I think, of how we deal with change generally. Many of us don't like the notion of change, I suspect, because we often believe that change is for the worse somehow, that nothing good ever comes out of change. Whether that's really true or not is a question to be asked. The one constant in life is change, we could argue. It helps perhaps to hold on to the notion that form is formed by the essence, by that burning bush moment perhaps, but it is not to be mistaken for the essence itself. As Steiner-Last says, the challenge is to find access to the core and live in its power. Live in its power. And that is ongoing, always ongoing, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. world without end. To find access to the core and to live in its power is ever ongoing liturgical work. And that might be worthwhile to remember whether we think change in liturgy has gone too far or not far enough. We cannot relegate our burning bush encounters to any form. We can only be grateful for forms helping us to access the core and to revisit access requirements if we need to, in ritual, in language and the like, if they should fail us. A few years ago, I came across a meditation exercise I find helpful when pondering change, which we are clearly facing always, personally and globally. And I'd like to finish by introducing you to this exercise for you to take away, play with, and ponder, if you're ready for that. I invite you to form a globe with your hands, with the tips of your fingers touching. Hold this for a moment and reflect on it. This is the world as it is now. Now slowly rotate your hands in a way that the thumb of one hand meets the little finger of the other. Hold that for a moment. That is the world to come. What do you feel and notice? And now turn back to the original position. Does your meditation on the world to come inform the world as it is now? Does it help us to ponder change as we aim to find access to the core and live in its power? And perhaps this already has been some kind of liturgical act in its own right, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be forever, world without end. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Christoph for that wonderful exegesis and even a beautiful meditation. We are very blessed. And now we turn to the last speaker we have with us. Obviously, it is still possible that Bridget might be able to get here, but I'm very pleased to introduce to my left Emily Sinclair, who's a graduate in theology and a youth leader for the Scottish Episcopal Church's Provincial Youth Network and a student nurse. So there's a very rich tapestry of experience and achievements there. And I will hand you over.
Thank you. So, thank you for the lovely introduction. Before I begin, I'll give you the briefest potted history of why I was invited to speak tonight. I've been involved in youth work in the Scottish Episcopal Church for nearly 15 years now, having previously been a delegate at the church's annual Youth Week. I studied theology at Corpus Christi, Cambridge, before becoming a religious, moral and philosophical studies teacher in Glasgow. I left teaching after just 1 year, and then did a variety of jobs before deciding to train as a learning disability nurse. I've just entered my second year of training. All the while, I was involved in the SEC through youth work and latterly the church's liturgy committee. Due to my new studies, I've had to take a reduced role in youth work, still involved as and where I can, and I've had to step down from the liturgy committee. But I am always interested in the role of liturgy and of young people in expressions of worship. I am, to quote my favourite podcaster, Dan Carlin, addicted to context. So I'm going to lay out some definitions and a background on young people before getting into further detail. To begin with, young people is more difficult to define than you might think. Someone on the street might think of a young person as everyone under the age of 18 or under the age of 21. For the Anglican Consultative Council, young people includes everyone under the age of 40. As I creep closer to 40, I take great comfort in that definition. However, for the purpose of this evening, I'm going to narrow my scope. It's not entirely arbitrary, but it is based on terms widely understood within the province. Let's say ages 13 to 25. It's still a wide age range, but it is more workable than everyone under 40, and it gives a reasonable cut-off from both sides of children and adults. Next, I'd like to think about the current generation of young people that fit this age bracket, the tail end of Gen Z, and more prominently, Gen Alpha. They've been born amidst falling birth rates, climate breakdown, and a redrawing of political norms. They didn't register the 2008 recession, and many only have hazy recollections of Brexit or the independence referendum. They have lived under 6 prime ministers, 2 monarchs, and 4 first ministers. Conservatives with a big and little c have dominated Westminster, and SNP liberalism and nationalism have defined Holyrood. They're more understanding of neurodivergence and trans rights, even as the means to access appropriate support is removed at local and national levels. They've watched their rights to protest diminish. I haven't even mentioned COVID or the cost of living crisis. And if you think this sounds depressing, believe me, they know it is. Young people are experiencing record levels of anxiety and depression, while waiting lists for NHS treatment soar. The relative stability of my millennial generation, and of Gen X before us, is no longer the norm. There were momentous moments in our lives, not least for myself, September the 11th and the subsequent war on terror. But the existential threats of nuclear annihilation or the global north at war felt impossible to imagine. The argument was, do we want GM crops grown in the UK? Rather than, will any crops survive to harvest as the climate breaks down? This is not to say that things were better in the old days, but I do believe, completely unfounded, that we did not feel like we lived in a perma-crisis, an omnishambles, a race to the bottom. Permanent connectivity has robbed older generations of our ability to compartmentalise. For young people, however, digital natives to their core, that connectivity is the sea that they swim in, while older generations thrash against its all-pervading current. Having set that thoroughly morose backdrop, I'd now like to turn to a slightly more hopeful foreground. The quiet revival of young people attending church has been debated at length over this summer. Young people seeking face-to-face connection are drawn to all styles of worship, from evangelical megachurches to high mass. In the context of the SEC and our own liturgical style, I'll now offer some of my insights into what young people have been doing over the years, and how this may guide the church as it considers its liturgical corpus. I'll restate, these are just generalizations, and I do not speak for every young person in the Episcopal Church. These are just impressions that I've gathered over 12 years of youth work. 15, I said at the beginning. Give or take. Broadly, I'd call it a liturgy of lived experience. Firstly, young people are more in favour of gender-neutral language. It is obvious to them that God is not gendered, and while they're happy to say that Jesus was a man, they're far more interested in Jesus as a person. What they dislike strongly is language that is so keen to be gender neutral that it renders the text difficult to say or unintelligible when heard. The Provincial Youth Committee, run by young people within the SEC's synodical structure, have tasked the Liturgy Committee to address this problem. At Youth Week, young people feel unafraid to take risks and experiment with language to find out what works for them. Numerous times over the years, when planning their worships, young people ask each other to say the Lord's Prayer in everyone's own preferred style and languages. This is a liturgy where young people invite Jesus to step into their lived experience, to open themselves to God in full confidence. When liturgy feels restrictive in its language, either by its historicity or if it feels overly performative and attempts to be modern, or worse, youthful, young people, and I suspect God too, smell the inauthenticity a mile away. Liturgy should offer us space to worship God reflexively, naturally, make it part of our being as it was always supposed to be. This natural and reflexive idea of worship brings me to my next point. Liturgy should be dynamic without feeling self-conscious. Movement and space matter. The embodied Christ matters to teenagers and to young people. Their own bodies are literally transforming in front of them, and that can be positive and negative. The messages of the Transfiguration should not be lost here. The body is a holy thing, made holy through Christ, and we are more than just vessels being filled with holy words to be poured out over 6 days and refilled on the 7th. If we are serious about creating liturgies that reflect our lived experience, we must do more to take our embodied, concrete self into that space. The current proviso within the liturgy means that the clergy are very active, walking, gesturing, touching. These acts have deep meaning, which are rarely explained. The President's hand positions during the Eucharistic prayer, for instance. The laity, by contrast, move very little liturgically beyond personal preferences to stand, sit, or kneel. The only major exception to this within our current liturgy is the walk to the altar to receive the Eucharist. Young people instinctively wish to challenge this in the safe space of Youth Week and be brought more fully into a visible and tangible expression of their worship. I am yet at a Youth Week to have a youth-led worship where everyone sits still for an hour and a half. There is literal movement across the site, miniature pilgrimages undertaken as a community to different sites and points of worship focus. There is movement within prayer space as people are invited to take handwritten prayers and create visual references within the worship space. But above all, this is an inclusive kind of dynamism. Those who would rather sit can, without judgment. Careful considerations are made to all young people who have differing needs, be they physical, sensory, or emotional. Teenagers are not perfect, and sometimes require prompting to remember who needs what in order to thrive in a worship. But they always come up with creative solutions in the planning stages. Is this dynamism simply a reflection of the energy of youth? Or is this a youthful rebellion to the static, stodgy liturgy of the everyday? Perhaps a little of both, but I would also credit young people today with being far more in touch with their physical, concrete self, who understands that worship can and should be a whole body exercise. The embodied self needs to be able to participate fully in the liturgy, and dynamic liturgies can make that happen. Which brings me to my final point. Active, meaningful participation helps to create a reflexive worship which allows young people to be more fully involved in their church community. They want to be more involved in the life of their home church. Egalitarianism, or shared ownership here, creates a space for trust and dialogue. the liturgy is no longer something done on a Sunday, but a part of life incorporated into ourselves, body and soul. Ordained priests and deacons within the church should be a source of constancy and stability, who trust their young congregants to be involved in the liturgy in more ways than simply carrying offerings or standing up during the notices to say what they did in Sunday school. Young people need trusted adults in their lives, sometimes simply to be a good foil to an argument. Those of you who looked after me when I was a young person will attest to this. But it is the responsibility of adults, along with people of all ages, to create and participate in liturgies that hold a nurturing space for all to explore their place within that life and community. You cannot hand young people a liturgy for the first time and simply say, "You're in charge for today's service, except for the Eucharist," and then leave them entirely to get on with it. Instead, a safe space where young people ask, "Can we do this?" fosters conversation, growth and development for the whole congregation to see what is, in the words of Cranmer, right and meet so to do. A liturgy for this generation should take these 3 points: inclusive language, dynamic liturgy, and shared ownership into consideration. Appreciate that as shopping lists go, it's a rather long and difficult one to execute. So if I can leave you with an overall message, let it be this: young people seek assurance rather than authority. A liturgy that builds this assurance in, giving us confidence to worship God freely, rather than to see ourselves in a submissive role within a hierarchy, will heal more wounds than it inflicts. The risen Christ offers us literally endless possibilities, and we must help young people to share in the worship of God in all of these wonderful, different lived experiences.
Thank you so much there to Emily. I mean, those of us who have got to a certain age are delighted to hear of the spontaneity in life within youth services that's all too obvious to people like herself. So thank you so much for that. Now, our fourth speaker would be Bridget Nichols, who's not here. So what we will do is we will have our interlude, and we will have an artistic presentation by Joe Clifford. Once the mechanics of this have been sorted out. Now, I don't really need to introduce Joe Clifford because I think she is genuinely a wonderful force of nature and art, but I will say she is an Edinburgh-based artist who is also a member of this wonderful church's cathedral's congregation, and I know her as a creator of the opera Jesus, Queen of Heaven. So we will move to that. Now, I would encourage you very strongly, because I can't see anybody putting anything into those little boxes, to write some nice questions that we can ask the speakers later, if you feel like it. I haven't got anything on the live. Well, I've got one thing on the live stream so far, and that's it. So take a piece of paper, write something interesting, and you have some time to do that while we set this up, etc. Okay, so we will now move to the second half of our presentation.
that's going pretty well. Oh, this works, doesn't it? My goodness. My plan tonight was to bring along a prayer bell, but I left it behind. So I wonder if I can do a little imitation of a prayer bell. And let's pause. Let's pause to think about our Mother the Earth. Our dear Mother Earth that holds up this amazing building, and all the other buildings in this astonishing city of Edinburgh. Let's remember that beneath all this marble and stone and brick and concrete and steel lies the earth, forgotten, taken for granted and terribly misused, but which gives us the food we need to eat, the water we need to drink, the air we need to breathe. So let's be silent for a moment and say, thank you. Thank you, Mother Earth. I learned to do this in Australia and then in America, where they call it acknowledgement of country. And the idea is to acknowledge the first peoples who inhabited the earth beneath the venue on which the event is taking place. It's important we do that here as well, because our ancestors were those colonists who first travelled across the ocean and displaced the First Nations from their land. Our ancestors were those travelling across the ocean in leaky boats, making the perilous journey to lands they did not know and which they thought they had discovered. And then generally what they did when they arrived is they'd take out a Union Jack and they'd plant it on the earth and they'd say, "We claim this territory in the name of King George or Queen Victoria or whichever chief thief and robber happened to be in charge of the country at the time." And then, over the years, what we would do is systematically plunder the territory of its wealth and its riches and ship it all back home to be the foundation of our prosperity today. We did that, we Brits, wherever we went. Well, we started in Ireland, of course. And then we went to, well, America, to India, to Africa, to the Near and Far East, to Australasia. And in Africa we did something worse. Because we kidnapped entire populations. We forced them, we enslaved them, we carried them across the ocean under atrocious conditions, and we forced them to work to death, to work our sugar and our tobacco plantations. And the profits from that evil trade became the investment in what we call the Industrial Revolution and is the source of our current wealth, even to this day. And I say this not to make us feel guilty, it's not for us to feel guilty, but it is for us to acknowledge what has happened. It is for us to think about how we can make amends. Because colonialism and slavery are terrible crimes and have left deep wounds. Deep wounds in our hearts and deep wounds on the face of our Mother Earth. And I think it's my job as an artist to find ways of healing those wounds and reminding my audience that it's possible to live differently, that it's possible to imagine and live in a world which is not about domination or exploitation, but is the expression of the deep truth that we all belong together. And that realization, that reminder, I think has its roots in the spiritual world. And so perhaps drama should be more like liturgy. And maybe liturgy should be more like drama. Because perhaps what I describe as my job is also our job as people who are concerned and who care about what happens in spaces like this. Om. Om. When I was a child down in England, I was sent away to boarding school to be taught how to be a man, to be taught how to be a gentleman and govern the British Empire. We were woken at 7 o'clock every morning by a bell. And then we had to stand naked in line in a freezing cold changing room to line up so we could take a cold plunge in a plunge pool that had been especially constructed for the purpose. We were taught to assume that as men we were masters of the universe and that women existed to serve us. And in order to learn how to be masters of the universe, in order to be taught how to rule the world, we had to learn to master our own bodies and master our own feelings too. And there we were, 8 years old, naked, shivering, traumatized at being separated from our mothers. And so we were also being taught we had to master our own feelings and bury our feelings of fear and loss. And we were encouraged to bully and torment those who could not control their feelings and who showed themselves to be vulnerable and weak. We were taught to suppress our capacity for empathy and pity, suppress our feelings of solidarity with each other and instead see each other as competitors for the top spots in the hierarchy. And that was how we were trained to be men. And then, when I was bigger and sent to a different boarding school, where I was still woken up by bells, and then made to walk each morning to chapel, where a big bell was tolling, telling us not to be late. And on the way we passed a statue of Field Marshal Haig, who was a boy at that school and learnt its lessons so well that he grew up to be a field marshal of the British Army and murdered 2 million people in the Battle of the Somme. And the Battle of the Somme and all the other battles he commanded in the First World War. And on the way to the chapel, we walked under a memorial archway with the names carved on it, the names of the young men from his school he'd grown up to murder. And I dare say that on the walls of the Resurrection Chapel here are the names of the young men he also killed. And I think of those young men and of me trying to be a young man, and the young men in the killing fields in Sudan, in Gaza and Ukraine, and the statue of the general and the memorial archway and services in chapel and shivering naked in the changing room, and how learning to ignore discomfort, obey orders and march in line was all designed to make it easier for men like that famous general to order me into uniform and make me surrender my free will and be sent into a battlefield to kill my fellow human beings and be ready to let them kill me. Because that, I was taught, was the essence of manhood. My mum was a clever woman, but she never even considered going to university or having a career. She just took it for granted. Her purpose in life was to find a husband and bear him children and look after them. Keep the house tidy and look after him. And nobody questioned that then. It was just how things were. And my dad said he felt sorry for my primary teacher, Miss Warrington, because she was too old to marry and was left on the shelf. My mum had a cousin called the Deaconess. Oh, and she must have had a name, but we just called her Deaconess and felt a bit embarrassed for her because she was absurd enough to want to be a priest. And in those days, men were men, and women were women, and men could not be women, and women could not be men, and women could certainly never be priests. And yet, in a tiny corner of the Lady Chapel here in this ultra-respectable building is a tiny plaque dedicated to Pamela Dora Skelton, who was the first woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest in Scotland. And so, in her quiet way, was a harbinger of revolution. A revolution in the way women understand their place in the world. The feminist revolution that we are all still living through, which I would say is the most profound and important change of these times. The feminist revolution whose work is so terribly incomplete, but which needs to continue and be strengthened if we are to create a more just and less violent world. In 1989, I travelled to Los Angeles. I had a production of one of my plays there, Lucy's play. So I spent a little bit of time in the richest country in the world. And later, that same year, I travelled to Bangladesh, to Dhaka, to watch another of my plays, Great Expectations. And so I travelled from the richest country in the world to the poorest. And I knew in my body that both places were part of the same world, that we live in one world and we all belong together. And that the obscene riches in one part of the world were the product of the obscene poverty in the other, and that the division of the world into rich and poor was not only monstrously unjust, but completely unsustainable. And in between those two journeys, I was in Egypt, in Cairo, and I turned on the television in my hotel room and they were knocking down the Berlin Wall. And I knew that the world order that had governed our lives up to that moment had completely collapsed. Of course, we were told in those days that the collapse of the Berlin Wall was a sign of the collapse of communism and the victory of capitalism, but it seemed to me that the Berlin Wall held up capitalism just as surely as it held up communism. And that what we were going to see was the collapse of capitalism too. And all those years later, we are seeing this happen as America disintegrates before our eyes. I could see very clearly communism had no answer to that division between rich and poor, and no answer to the ecological crisis that back then was beginning to engulf us. Capitalism had no answer either. That the way we understood economics no longer served us. And we're seeing that now too. That we have to devise a new economics and a new politics because our political systems no longer served us. And we are witnessing this now in the decay of our own political institutions. And our traditional understanding of science no longer served us. Einstein and the principle of relativity are in the process of transforming our way of understanding the world. And the same is true of our understanding of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And even though I was in the closet still then, I knew for sure my male identity did not help me. And I was going to have to renounce it. And that was true for me as a trans woman, but it's true for cis men also. If we look around our world at Trump, at Putin, at Netanyahu, at so many men in the public and private spheres, we can see them holding on to a male identity that no longer serves them and which has become toxic and a danger to us all. It's because we're in a stage of human history that's a bit like the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern world. And then that profound change in human consciousness was ushered in by the new invention of printing. And we too are living through the invention of computing, of the internet, of artificial intelligence that is transforming our world in ways we cannot imagine. I wrote my first plays on a typewriter, and here I am, reading this out to you from a tablet which has the capacity to connect me to every piece of knowledge in the world. And so it's no use for us to imagine we can go on living the way we always have, worshipping the way we always have, making theatre or art the way we always have. Our job is to give hope to our communities, caught up in the terrors of profound change, and empower our communities to imagine a new and better world. Oh, oh. Let's think about those first colonists in their leaky wooden boats, setting off on dangerous journeys across the oceans to conquer the world. And almost always when they went to places like America and Africa and India, Southeast Asia and Australasia, those tough, manly frontiersmen came across people like me. People who had been born male but were wearing women's clothes and performing women's tasks. The Two-Spirit people of America, Yandaudu of West Africa, Mushe of Mexico, Travesti of Brazil, and many, many more. Khwaja of Pakistan, Hijra of India. Well, we tend to call such people trans, but it's not really accurate. They had and still have identities that don't fit Western categories of gender, of male and female, and that being all there is. We belong to a third gender, or maybe a fourth, or maybe a fifth, who knows? And when the first colonists came across people like me and their new colonists, they found us disgusting and tried their best to destroy and suppress us. Just as my teachers and elders did their best to suppress and destroy the woman in me. And failed. Oh, oh. There are people in the Indonesian archipelago, the Bugis, who believe there are 5 genders: womanly women, manly men, womanly men, and bisu. And we bisu are both men and women. There is a sacred dimension to our work because we are a bridge between earth and heaven, just as art is, just as liturgy is, a bridge between the ancient values of heaven and the modern conditions of an ever-changing world. Capitalism tells us we are individuals living in a material world, always in competition with each other, that life is about the struggle for money and power. And we are called to live in that world, but we are also called to live and work in opposition to that world, to communicate the ancient truth that we all belong together and that we must treat each other the way we want to be treated ourselves, and learn with all our heart and all our strength to love ourselves, to love our neighbor, and love God. Oh, oh, there is a story of a prophet of God who was broken, defeated, and fleeing for her life. She went one day's journey out into the wilderness and collapsed there under a juniper tree and said, "Take me, Sister Death, take me, for I'm defeated and I'm good for nothing." But Sister Death did not take her. Instead, she sent an angel with a flask of water and bread baked on coals, touched the prophet and said, "Arise and eat." So the prophet ate and drank, and then lay down again, being so very weary. And the angel came again a second time and touched the prophet and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too much for you." And the prophet arose and did eat and did drink, and then began walking. She walked for 40 days and 40 nights until she came to Mount Horeb, to the holy mountain of God, and then, seized with terror, she hid in a deep cave. And there was a voice came and said, "What are you doing here?" And the prophet said, "I've been doing my best to do good in the world and I've failed. They've killed all my companions and I'm the only one left, and they want to kill me too." And the voice said, "Go out and stand in the entrance to the cave." And a great wind roared past, breaking the rocks in pieces. But the mother was not in the wind. And after the wind came an earthquake, but the mother was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but our mother was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. And it was so. And the prophet heard it, and wrapped her face in her cloak, and stood at the entrance to the cave, waiting. And as she waited, she renewed her strength and went back to do her work in the world. Thank you. Goodness, hello, you there standing at the entrance. I've been worrying about you. I wanted you to come in and make yourself comfortable. Yeah, of course, dear.
Stay there. Bridget, welcome. In order to allow you to get your breath, we've had a few moments, and it will be a few moments, just for if anybody wants to make a response, or Joe thinks that's appropriate. This is an opportunity to do that. But that was so powerful that perhaps that's not even appropriate. But I would like to welcome anybody who wishes to respond to that remarkable event, liturgical event. And then perhaps we can change the program a little to allow Bridget her contribution as well.
If liturgy is to take us into a different space, a sacred space, I feel that is really what you did with your voice and your wonderful improvisation of the prayer bell. It was great. Sometimes I think when I join in some of the watch online liturgy, it's when I can receive it, when I'm not delivering it, it's the pace is part of what makes you feel, we're in a different space now, we're in a different kind of time now. Everything is slower, we're not rushing. And there is something so slow and rich about what you did. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad it worked. I had no idea what I had to do. Thank you. I love the sound of your work, and I loved that. That was just so beautiful. Perhaps I should also, just thinking about your lovely book that I can't wait to get hold of, is that I have copies of my script, The Gospel According to Jesus, Queen of Heaven, which imagines Jesus coming back to earth as a trans woman, in my bag for sale, for a tenner, they're a bargain. So if you're interested, let me know.
Thank you. That one. Thank you so much, Joe. That was, yeah. I have a real interest in military history. As a pacifist, I'm always fascinated by the motivation. And I've been trying desperately to remember, there's a quote, and I think it might be Hemingway, where he talks about there's two people walking a battlefield and they have a conversation about what leads men to slaughter. And there's a whole section where they talk about you had to believe in Christmas and Jesus and Sunday afternoons playing cricket to do this. You couldn't have that war now. And I look around and I wonder actually if we still could. And I just found your piece really, genuinely, really emotional. And I just, frankly, I'm quite terrified that the violence inherent in binary is still with us, and very much the violence that led to those kind of global conflicts is only maybe in a 1-inch grave. So yeah, thank you so much for that. It was really...
Thank you. What I was trying to get across, what I'm slowly beginning to understand as I look back at my upbringing, is that in order to do, well, they do say that if you want to train people to be torturers, you have to torture them first. And so no doubt Putin suffered torture, and that he learnt to dehumanize himself, and that's how he's able to dehumanize other people in this appalling way. And yes, it's very concerning, and it's very hard to know how to resist it, but I think we have to live differently. And I think that people, I don't want to sound pretentious, but people like myself who have taken a very deliberate and very conspicuously different path, I think it's important. And I think the fact that now, at the moment, we have objects of such hatred from, well, people like Putin, people like Trump, is an indication that, or that man that just got murdered the other day, loathed us, wanted us wiped off the face of the earth. It's because there is a very profound and a very important challenge to all this, that we, all of us here, need to work together. Somehow. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. There's no more words, I think, that can be said there. Perhaps we could just take a few moments now to reassemble the tables here, and then I can hand back to Catherine, and if Bridget feels that she could make her contribution before we move into the final session of the evening, which would be more of a kind of general discussion employing the questions that I see you've given. So thank you very much indeed, Joe, once again.
So it's with enormous pleasure that we welcome Bridget Nichols, who has negotiated an incredibly difficult trip with massive delays, none of which were her own fault, and we are so grateful to have her here. Bridget is a lecturer in liturgy at the Irish Theological Institute of Dublin, a former president of the Societas Liturgica, which is a leading international body of liturgical scholars and education practitioners. So we are incredibly happy that you've made it, Bridget, and we are so grateful, and we long to hear your words.
Thank you, Catherine, and my profound apologies for appearing so late. If I had been able to get into the building, I'd have been here earlier, but it's locked up against tourists at night, arriving with the suitcases. Anyway, I'm not, of course, able to draw on anything that's been said already, so I shall have to speak into a kind of a void, but it was a great privilege to arrive in time to hear Joe Clifford, so I'm glad to have had that opportunity. So, liturgy and change, and as I was waiting in the airport today, I was also thinking about Monday morning when I will meet a new cohort of ordination candidates who will be starting a 12-week module in liturgy. And thinking about what I wanted to do with them in a part of the Anglican communion which is relatively conservative, in some ways quite divided. And I think the one thing that I truly want to avoid is turning them into technicians of the prayer book, which would be the easy way to do it. Just make them competent. But I think what I would like them to have is a sort of experience of hearing it made strange, which coming in and hearing the Elijah story told in a different voice is a very strange-making experience, and it's very renewing as well at the same time. And so I think that there are kind of angles on change. The first is the organic change that is happening anyway, and that those of us who've been churchgoers remember in our own lifetimes of the change in the way people's voices sounded, the change in the words we've been using, the change in the personnel at the front, the fact that people no longer fasted before communion or knelt or dressed up in their best clothes to go to church. All of those things, those are small and domestic changes, but changes that have just happened. But it's the more dramatic ones, perhaps, which have been the compellers of attention. And I think that they come confusingly from two angles. There's a top-down form of change which comes from authorities who come to the conclusion that it's time that a church had its liturgy revised, and there's a bottom-up which draws on the interests of particular constituencies and presents their needs eventually with enough conviction so that something is done about it. And I think that perhaps we've reached a point where the grassroots impulse towards change has become more powerful than the top-down, but it is still the authorizing bodies certainly in the mainstream churches, for want of a better word, who are then tasked with providing liturgical responses. And that seems to leave us in something of a problematic situation, I think not least because so much responsibility is placed on words, and liturgy is so much more than the words, but they're an easy target for critics, and they're the easiest thing to get wrong. I'm at the moment working through the final stages of an article which will eventually go into a journal that David's editing, but that's taken me back through various revision projects to produce alternative forms of Anglican collects, because the language of the official versions was unfriendly, archaic, stiff, and sometimes using more words to say very little. To another project where baptism material just seemed to be missing the mark. To another project which tried to provide resources for survivors of abuse, and received a spectacularly hostile reception from the survivors themselves who hadn't really been consulted. And then to another project which comes out of the Irish context for producing resources for people who've suffered miscarriage or stillbirth or neonatal bereavement. And that's been a peculiarly effective success, partly because it's allowed, it sort of burst a bubble of silence around an event which people step back from politely and let people grieve over. It has given a public voice. And I think I sort of puzzle over all these situations and think that they're not exactly, they're not telling us one thing. They're telling us something perhaps about the difficulties of change and about the ease of getting it wrong. So I suppose it perhaps takes us back to some kind of a core reflection as to what we hope that liturgy will do in the end. And it's perhaps the last thing I want to say before the plenary takes up again is I don't think its purpose is to solve our problems in areas where they can't, when they should be solved somewhere else. I think it is still a way of trying to articulate a relationship with God and a way of trying to imagine the God we wish to relate to. And that is difficult and subtle and certainly dependent on all sorts of things besides just providing the materials, not least responding to the needs of individuals, to the needs of the bewildering variety of human identity, and coming to terms with that as a routine part of liturgical provision will be something that I hope very much will be the next phase. But those are rather confused thoughts, and thank you.
We've got about half an hour before we're scheduled to draw to a conclusion. So before we perhaps move on to the questions that Catherine's been collecting, I would like an opportunity of just asking the members of the panel if they have any particular thoughts in the light of all that's been said. I know it's very hard on Bridget because she hasn't actually heard this very rich fare that we've had earlier in the evening. But I would like an opportunity to do that if any of you wish to say anything in the light of whatever's happened this evening. Silence being the response to that, I wonder whether I could actually prompt a question, going back to Mary's initial paper, when you talked about a number of aspects, including your own development in theology and how important that particular exercise, the theological exercise, is in liturgical revision, and change. And that seems in some ways rather remote from some of the other things that we've discussed this evening in terms of change from other perspectives, as Bridget puts it, from the bottom up rather than the top down. And how do those two things actually coincide as we look to the liturgy of the future?
One of the things I was struck by was Christoph talking about the burning bush moment and how our liturgy facilitates us to have that kind of encounter. And I think that sort of takes us outside. That is a wonderful challenge, isn't it? And what, I guess, we have so many perspectives and so many people and ages and personalities and experiences all in the one place that we kind of have to be grateful for the Holy Spirit who can move us in ways that we do not predict necessarily or control. I think I do find it interesting how much is our liturgy about our doctrine and theology and all of that, and how much is it really about something else. And it's important that we honour the whole person and the whole group of people that we might have with us, and somehow find a way to enable that encounter when people will be approaching what we are providing, what is being curated, from so many different perspectives. And I don't have an easy answer. It's a mystery.
If I may be allowed one further sort of extension from that, really to Bridget. Bridget and Jeremy, who are sitting there, and I are involved in another little project at the moment. And one of the things that emerges, I think, is how we do, as in so many aspects of life, also have to have recourse to experts. And that includes experts in language and how language works, and how much rather careless material is spoken about in liturgical matters linguistically, and how far we need to be attentive to really what can become very technical discussions in order to, is it getting it right, if that's the right expression?
This is a very complex field. I think that's an obvious thing to say, and there is so much about responses to liturgical language which I think depend sometimes quite idiosyncratically on taste, and taste itself is something that shifts through history. You only need to go back through prayers of previous generations, not generations that far behind us, to see how styles have changed. But I think David's question is really, it's more about precision, and it's more about trying to create an economy and a definition that doesn't have recourse to circuitous forms of expression and manages to avoid the sentimental and doesn't take refuge in things which sound rather more promising than they are able to deliver when it comes to trying to plumb any meaning out of them. I've been, in the last couple of days, rereading an article by a French theologian. He's an interesting person, an old man now. He's been both a parish priest and a liturgical teacher in a quite prestigious institute in Paris all his life. But he says the problem is that the language of the liturgy is not necessarily in itself difficult. It's just that liturgical expression often puts words together in a very peculiar way. And one of the examples he gives is seated at the right hand of the Father. What does that mean to somebody who isn't conversant with that kind of speech normally. His view of it, working in a Roman Catholic context where one has rather less room to manoeuvre because there is a magisterium centrally determining much of what can be said in church, but that there is a way of a sort of pastoral decoding that can get around it. Now that's to take a rather oblique route around David's question, and I think I haven't really confronted the business of precision. I'm looking at another prayer today, which seems to be doing terribly well until it concludes with a petition that we may walk the joyful road of sacrifice and peace. I've no idea what that means. But I just accept that I feel it ought to be avoided if possible. So those are bad examples. But the question is how we do it better, and perhaps the only way to do it better is a relatively painful way of doing it with enough consultation with enough of the people for whom this really matters until we get it right.
Thank you. Can I speak? Okay.
One of the things that strikes me as you're talking is that it is important to be practitioners and to understand about some kind of rules of language and have some kind of structure and rhythm. So it's somehow bringing together, and for me, I think that's one of the reasons I'm an Anglican as well, and why I enjoy writing in that, I suppose, milieu, because it's bringing together of what's got a great history and tradition, and also bringing something new into it so it also feels fresh and alive and something has changed. And actually to try and bring some of the rhythms of liturgy to keep them so as you don't just throw everything up in the air. That can be very rich, a very rich source, while you also drop something new into the pool.
So, speaking of very rich sources and soil, we come to some very interesting, some very wonderful questions, I think. And I'm going to apologise if we don't get through them all, but some of them are quite complex. Many of them are identifying, I think, what we've already brought up, which are the various tensions existing in liturgy between tradition, innovation, art and tradition, and so on. So I'm starting here within the room. There are a couple on the live stream I will pick up as well if I have time. So, question number 1. Whilst I agree embodiment and inclusivity are important, I question whether too much dynamism in worship risks a lack of unity between the congregation and the wider church, past and present. How do we preserve the unity and continuity while making room for people's needs? And how do we encourage focus on God rather than inadvertently putting too much focus on our own identities? Would anyone like to respond, perhaps? Emily.
I wonder, there was a couple of keywords from my own talk, so I wonder if that was in relation to some of the things I'd said about dynamism and moving. Short answer, I don't know. A longer way of saying that, I understand the concern about when we lose sight of what the focus of worship is. I feel it quite strongly, actually. I much always preferred, weirdly, putting on an alb to turning up in my own clothes for service, because I didn't have to think, and I kind of lost my sense of identity in that moment, and I can just serve. I always quite liked that aspect of worship. In terms of keeping our focus where it needs to be while holding on to everyone's needs, I think that is done through really careful pastoral work. I think, as Bridget was saying about in the Catholic Church and with their less room to manoeuvre, I think that requires your congregation to be more than just a group of people who happen to meet on a Sunday. I think that is why this kind of liturgy that I sort of envisage has to have more about bringing people together, and there has to be more to the church and to the church life than turn up, sit in the back of a congregation with a blue book and a notice sheet and a hymn book and the gift aid envelope and my bag and my jacket and not having enough room for all of the things at any given time. So I think I get really focused on all those bits of paper. So I think if we do want to change our liturgy and move forward in a way that brings everyone, we have to do it in such a way that we are thinking quite radically different. And I appreciate that is really scary, and I have no answers as to how we actually do that in practice. I leave that to experts.
I just wonder, in the light of that concern for what one might call the dangers of self-preoccupation at all different levels, concern for ourselves, whether Christoph has anything to say. On the other hand, you mentioned the notion of liturgy beginning in a mystical experience, and particularly you referred to Moses and the burning bush, from which, of course, God spoke. It's not particularly Moses who said anything in the first instance, but it was God who spoke. It was an act of revelation, and whether what we now call mystagogy is in fact something that we need to hold very carefully as part of our liturgical concerns, as well as all the other cultural and legitimate cultural issues as well.
Right. Yes, I mean, and it's a loaded word, mystical, as well, in that sense, because that means different things for different people. I mean, I would say that it's anything that, you talk to God and you expect to hear something. That's mystical already, in that sense. But I think it is imperative to start from that point of the deeper encounter, whatever that may be. I mean, as Jo was doing so powerfully in her acknowledging the ground, even going layers and layers and layers, actually that settled us. That kind of opening of dimensions is what we need, and some of that might be in the words we use, might be in the silences we do, and how we acknowledge things. But how do we translate that then into liturgical rites is a completely different question. I'm wondering, actually, that's more maybe towards the question we had before. Because as a liturgical practitioner, I find that we actually do, in reality, develop our liturgical reforms very much out of the material that is already there. And to understand that material and why it's there is so important, I find. I'm a musician by background, as I said before. The real great composers in this world have always broken the musical rules, but they knew how to break them because they knew the rules in the first place. And then they do something and it's amazing, and then the rules become that. And then we move on from there. So I kind of think that there is an element of that. But whenever I think that experience of God breaks in, that mystical, that burning bush, that allows us maybe to stop and be quiet, like you've done for us tonight, and I'd say, what's been going on here, and how will that feed in I will say the Eucharist very differently next time. I'll say it, or whatever it is, and then moving on from there into developing of materials and so on and so forth. Sorry.
I want the too much focus on our own identities rather than God. I kind of want to say yes and no. So the no, first of all, is it's very easy to say that and not recognise that actually we've been privileging a particular kind of identity in our language and in our liturgy. White, male, able-bodied, heterosexual. So yes, it's good to get more variety in, but it's also no in that, yes, I'll forget now, but the other one anyway. I went to Greenbelt a couple of years ago, and I was very struck by how much emphasis there was on God loves you and accepts you how you are, and that was kind of like the really big message. And of course, that's good. But I found myself thinking, and this is probably my Presbyterian background, what about sin? None of us are perfect. Where do we find sin? Okay, so we're not wanting to say we need to feel that we're sinful because we have a particular gender or sexuality or whatever. Great. But sin hasn't disappeared. And we need to somehow leave space for that as well, I think, in our encounter, which is perhaps more problematic. How do we deal with our sin in liturgy? Well, initially we confess it. What are we confessing to? So I think there needs to be also a balance where we take that into account.
And this question is really about iconoclasm on a different note completely. So if liturgy forms the people of God for the liturgy, after the liturgy, which liturgical statues need to be toppled first? Thinking about post-colonialist actions already taking place. Who can we pass that to? Perhaps we should move on. If it's got everybody quiet. Maybe not. Okay.
I don't know whether the originator of the question has in mind that maybe one of the things we ought to give up are beloved prayer books or things. I think they have in the past been a target as a sense of a kind of an inhibition. But I suppose it's always very salutary to have to ask yourself, what would I not want to give up if I were trying to be an agent towards a more spacious kind of liturgy where more people felt that they were comfortable and had a place, because clearly it's not a one-way traffic, that the people who have a kind of established position in a community have to give something up to if it's going to change its shape, and that can be almost the most painful, whether it's the trivial of the seat that you've been sitting in for 20 years, or whether it's something much more dramatic, like an order of the way things are done, or the question of who officiates or how they officiate, or who's at the table. I think that perhaps there are a number of people in this room for whom a kind of a dignity, a grandeur of language might be a hard thing to have to relinquish. But then perhaps it can be found in other ways which may be less ostentatiously grand or rhetorically impressive, but at the same time perhaps just as eloquent, and just as capable of being committed to the memory over a longer term. And I think all of this stuff happens quite slowly, and it does in a way give you time to get used to it, but maybe maybe a certain kind of liturgical bereavement is a necessary part of moving on to another stage.
Well, that reminds me of Rowan Williams, who said, what do you need to give up, what do you need to sacrifice that your neighbour might thrive, which is, a challenging question. So that's something to add to that. Oh, yes, that was the other thing. So we had a prayer course at our parish, and the speaker said, what is your niggle? And she gave an example of people she knew who are always complaining about the same things, and she can predict what they're going to say next. But she said, think of what your niggle is and try and turn it into a prayer. So I think there's so many things we could topple, but my biggest niggle is God is He. So I'm really trying to topple that one, and I guess we just go for whatever really niggles us that we want to see changed. And she said, I never imagine what the world would be like when that niggle isn't there anymore. Imagine a different world, which you give us a way to do that by moving our hands round. So let's do that.
I wonder if I could again intrude, although I'm not technically a speaker. Working with Jeremy Smith, who's sitting there, I've mentioned before, one of the, for me, liberating aspects of romantic language, and I mean romanticism in the historical sense of the word, is it was said that words are living things. And I find in liturgy, there's nothing wrong at all with loving the words of the Book of Common Prayer, for example, provided one doesn't become obsessed with them and set them on particular pedestals, because to do that to any living thing is a deadening and stultifying thing. Living things, all living things are to be related to, seems to me. Do we understand each other? Do we understand living things? We don't precisely understand, but we're capable of relating to them, loving them, and so on and so forth. And I think the same is true of language. And that's true for me of all the words of the liturgy. So at the moment I'm struggling with the notion of Our Father who art in heaven. And we've discussed, is Father, is it a metaphor? Is it not a metaphor? Is it a name? But it's a living thing, and it has its benefits and its deficits. And sometimes it has to make way for other living things which take its place as well. So I just like to think of liturgical language as a living thing, and that changes your relationship with it, I think, I hope.
Okay, so here's, I think, unrelated, but, well, I suppose related at a deeper level. So where does safety come from in liturgical practice? So either, is the assurance part of the fellowship that builds up in communal acts to allow visiting liminal spaces, or is the assurance necessarily to be assumed theologically to inform that safe interaction? So I think it's a question, really, isn't it, about tradition and working within a particularly preformed liturgy. Can you be safe within it from the communal nature of the act? Or does it come from some, well, not distant, it doesn't say distant, but does it come from a theological place where you can assume that the interaction will be safe? Christoph, perhaps this is for you.
I'm not quite sure I understood the question completely. A kind of sense of safety. So it's about safety in worship, feeling safe when worshipping, and where that might come from. How could that be? I mean, that it'll come from so many different places. That's not liturgical at all, but is it a safe space? In the sense, is safeguarding it adhered to? Is it safe to come? Is the space itself accessible? And then it will, I think, very much depend on harking back to actually what you said, Mary, in your presentation earlier about, personality rather than theologies, sometime in terms of the way we experience liturgy. It'll depend on what is safe for you. I'm an introvert, I love silences. If I'm given space, that gives me safety. For somebody else, it might be a group of people they can relate to. So I'm not quite sure whether I've got anything else to say than that, but I think it is a big question. How do we make our liturgical spaces safe?
I think we have time for one more question and then perhaps draw to a conclusion.
Okay, so this I know is from a young person. So in most mainstream services or liturgy, inclusive language is not used. How can I feel more at ease with this when I don't feel included? Do I just have to feel uncomfortable and fight?
Thanks. That makes me quite sad. In and of itself, I don't think being uncomfortable is necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes. I think it can be a space for us to be challenged and a space for us to grow and learn. Inclusive language, however, is about bringing everyone in, and when people feel like language isn't bringing them in, that's no longer about growth, that is about being held back. In individual churches, I don't actually know unless, if you feel comfortable. I think this is where all those conversations about how we move forward, what we're comfortable with, niggles with our neighbour, what are we prepared to give up for our neighbour to thrive. I think that is where the groundwork of liturgical change begins, as everyone has said. And I think sorry, I'm really struggling with this one. I'm reminded, I always come back and I always think of, I don't know if some of you will remember the Cascade conferences we had around human sexuality and around same-sex marriage within the Episcopal Church. And I was involved in those conversations, and they were some of the most incredible days and sort of important work that the church did. And I remember being like, I can't believe I get to be here and be a part of this. And I remember having conversations with people who felt very strongly different from myself. And yet that space was, I keep saying the word space and I keep saying the word safety, but I think they're really important things. I think it was one where we could all just listen and be heard. And I think that is the starting point for any place we want to bring different language into a service. Excuse me. I also think that don't ever be afraid to change the words that you're saying out loud. Not many other people will hear. I have been known to occasionally edit as I go with my blue book. And if the little rebellion begins right there just for yourself, sometimes that's no bad thing. But I think remembering that as a church, we have been capable of having good, godly discussion that was fruitful and peaceful and led to a situation where the vast majority of Episcopalians live in peace with the decision that was reached. I think that's really important to bear that in mind as we move forward with these liturgical changes. I'm really sorry, I'm not sure I've actually answered that question, but it's a really tricky one. And I I think having a good pastoral team around you is really important as well for those kind of thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. So,
could I ask Bridget perhaps just to give the final comment to that question before we conclude?
Well, I think Emily's been very charitable about this. I don't think that there are any real excuses for not using inclusive language in liturgy anymore. I think there are some that, the question that exercises us much more now is gendered language for God. But I think the inclusive language question is fairly conclusive now, that you cannot expect people to attend acts of worship where there's a kind of willful ignoring of a diversity of gender. I think maybe really something I meant to say, and then it escaped me for a moment, and then I came back. That Wallace Stevens wrote a poem which it's really a reflection on one of Picasso's blue paintings with the man with the blue guitar, it has a lovely opening when this stranger, a sort of cattle ranger, appears in a new community, and the people are curious about him. They notice him playing this guitar, and they say, "You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." And the man replies, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar." And I've often wondered what would it be like? What would the equivalent of the blue guitar be if you brought it into a liturgical world? I have no answer, but I'd like to think there could be one.
Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Sorry if your question, I couldn't bring it forward. There were such rich questions and I couldn't get through them all. But thank you to the panellists. And we really must turn now to Alison, who has got a concluding word, as Alison is our star.
I think that's a bit much, but I'll use this one, shall I? Is that on? Does it work? Does it work? Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming. I have enjoyed this enormously, although we're not many in numbers, perhaps we're larger in the streaming, and I hope that has happened. I hope the live streaming has taken place, but it will be recording, and we will be able to see, you will be able to see it again or pass it on to people who might have been interested but not able to be here. I do have to say some thank yous. I have to say thank you to the Cathedral for allowing us to use their space, and to the Liturgy Committee for giving us money to pay for the various things that we had to buy in, or various people's travelling expenses. And also to other donors for their money to make this event happen. But most of all, of course, I have to say thank you. I'm going to stand over here so I can see them, to our wonderful panellists, and to Joe for giving us a most extraordinary reflection and meditation, which certainly is going to stay with me for a long time. I have found this very, very stimulating and encouraging. I too get discouraged sometimes about the state of the liturgy, but I have seen so much reimagining and so much attention and so much careful thinking and people getting involved. So thank you so much for your questions. Even if we didn't actually manage to address them, I think we'll try and do something with all the questions. Maybe we can somehow or other get them up online with the rest of the material. So thank you all so much for coming. I won't say much longer because if, like me, you're probably getting cold and it's time to go home. But wonderful panellists, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. I hope you have. And good night and God bless you.